air travel, and venous thrombosis. Is there a risk? You're listening to ReachMD XM 157, the channel for medical professionals. Welcome to the Clinicians Roundtable. I'm your host, Dr. Gary Kohn, and my guest today will be Dr. Suzanne Cannegieter, who is Associate Professor of Epidemiology at the Leiden University Medical Center in Leiden, the Netherlands. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Cannegieter. We appreciate your time, and we're looking forward to talking to you about air travel and the connection, if any, with venous thrombosis. Perhaps before we get started with that, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in this line of investigation.
I've been working into the field of venous thrombosis for a couple of years and interested in etiology especially. And the reason why we started looking into the role of air travel was really because of something that happened in the UK in the year of 2000. I'm not sure if you're aware of the things that happened at the time, but there was a young lady who traveled from Australia back to the UK, and she died from pulmonary embolism when she arrived at Heathrow. And that led to enormous attention in the media and in newspapers, and everyone's talking about this. And there were even questions being asked in the House of Commons. And all that attention really led to raising of money for the studies, and that was how the Wright Project was formed, and it was an international cooperation between several centers in the UK and with us.
I see. So you're part of a larger group of international investigators. Did each of the component investigators, did they each have a piece of that? In other words, did you have a specific question you were charged with looking at?
No, I was more coordinating several aspects of the project, and we did mainly epidemiological studies in different forms, and we also looked at the mechanism, so we also did more pathophysiological studies. Well, actually, we're still doing them, so it's still running.
Before 2000, obviously, a lot of people have been traveling a lot of miles, and we were kind of never really aware of any possible connection with deep venous thrombosis. Had there been any research done before then? Were you aware of any, or are you aware of any before 2000?
No, that's right. That's an interesting point. There hasn't been any research before that, and there were the occasional case reports, obviously. People, even medical doctors, writing reports about themselves when they experienced something like a DVT or a pulmonary embolism after long air travel. But there were never any controlled studies, and that was only after the media attention in the UK that they started to be performed.
When you started to look at the problem, what was your approach? Did you think about it in terms of more statistical, epidemiological? Did you think about it in physiological terms? What was your thought process in approaching this?
Well, obviously, when we started, we had no idea if there was really a connection, because obviously venous thrombosis is not a rare disease, and air travel is very frequent nowadays too. So all those case reports and even this case in the UK could just have been a coincidence, and that they just occur together. So that was the first thing that we wanted to find out, if the risk was increased at all after air travel. So that was the first aim of the project, to define the extent of the risk. And then secondly, to find out if that when the risk was indeed increased, if there were any high-risk groups that we could identify. And furthermore, we were interested, obviously, in the mechanism, if it was just the cramped position and all those things, or maybe if there was something more in an airplane. Those were the main goals.
Let's take the first of that, whether or not there was a connection. What have you found so far in your research?
First one that we published was a case control study, and that was published last year. It was part of a large study that we were already doing into lots of different risk factors for thrombosis. And it was done in a couple of thousand of patients and a couple of thousand of controls. And those were asked more or less by chance. We were at that point not really looking into this, but we had asked them if they had been traveling, yes or no. So we had that information, and it was quite easy to quickly calculate if the risk was indeed increased. So from that study, for the first time, we could find a relative risk of about 2, something like that. So that indicated that the risk was twofold increased. And at the same time, other centers also published case control studies, and they also found similar results. So they were all in the range of a relative risk increase of 2 to 4-fold.
In a case control setting, did that allow you to come to any conclusions about specific groups that were at higher risk?
Yes, we did. At that time, we looked at a couple of genetic risk factors. So those were factor V Leiden and a prothrombin mutation that in general increased risk for thrombosis. And we looked if that was the case as well in these people who had been traveling, and we found that indeed, especially factor V Leiden mutation, sort of additionally increased the risk. So you could more or less multiply both risks, and so it would be extra increased in people who were flying. So we looked at those people, and also, that was quite interesting, we did not have very many data on these people, and we could not look at a large number of risk groups, but we did look at height and found that both very tall people and short people had an increased risk. That was something new. In normal life, height has no relation to the occurrence of thrombosis. But yeah, and here it clearly did, and it was, I guess, it was about 5 times increase or something like that. For tall people, you can sort of imagine that they have extra problems if they are even more in a cramped position in an airplane, of course.
And more vasculature for the problem to happen.
Yes, and all your limbs are folded in funny positions. So you can imagine that. But for short people, we were a little bit surprised. And then later on, I spoke to people who are actually quite short, and they told me that they're always very uncomfortable in an airplane because their feet don't touch. There's extra pressure in the back of your knees. And so then that makes sense too, I guess. And actually, we found that, again, in a completely separate study that was published more recently in PLOS Medicine. And it was in a completely different cohort with other people, and it was another design. But in that same study, we found exactly the same. So also there, we found that shorter people had an increased risk as well as tall people.
Very interesting. If you've just tuned in, you're listening to the Clinicians Roundtable on ReachMD XM157, the channel for medical professionals. I'm your host, Dr. Gary Kohn, and I'm speaking today with Dr. Suzanne Cannegieter. And we're discussing air travel and venous thrombosis. So, Suzanne, we've talked about a couple of risk factors, the factor V Leiden and height, both tall and short, to our surprise. Any other risk factors that came to light?
Yes, we also found that high BMI was a risk factor, and that was also described in the second epidemiological study. The pill I'm now talking about not the case control study, but the second part of the Wright Project that we did. That was in a cohort study. I haven't yet mentioned that. That was a follow-up study of a cohort of people of employees of multinationals and large organizations. So all really people who need to fly a lot for their work. And we had a couple of thousand of them. I think it was almost 9,000. And they were all questioned, and we also asked them if they had thrombosis. And we could link the occurrence of thrombosis to their flight records because we had the databases from all the companies. So that way we could exactly calculate the risk after being exposed to a flight as compared to periods that they did not fly. And in that study, so that was a follow-up study, we also confirmed the risks that I just mentioned to you that we earlier found. And we also found an increased risk in people who use the pill.
Let me ask you this. I know that early on when some of this research was proposed and certainly when some of the papers started to be produced, the industry, or at least some critics of the studies, said that, well, that would be the case of in any kind of long travel, boats or buses or airplanes or trains. Was there any effort, either in your work or in others, to specifically pull out the fact that this is airline travel versus other kinds of travel?
Yes, that's true. It's an interesting point, and it hasn't been studied that much. For some reason, air travel is always gets more attention. But you're right. In that first project that I talked about, this case control study, we also asked if people had been driving or being in a bus or a train for a long period of time. And in that study, we found the same extent of the risk for being in a car as well. But that has not been studied much by other groups or other centers, so it has not really been confirmed much.
When you started to see your results, both in terms of absolute risk and high-risk groups, were you surprised? You've been interested in this field for a while. Did this fit with your common sense notion of the disease, or was it surprising to you? Or how did you interpret this?
No, it was more or less what I expected, and mainly because I thought about the immobilization situation and being exposed to this situation for quite a long time. So I wasn't really surprised so much. I had expected that more or less.
I guess the most final common pathway is that of being sedentary and stasis of blood flow. Is that sort of how you interpret this?
Yes, that would be, I guess, the first explanation you would consider, and that makes sense, obviously, from all the knowledge we have. The only new thing that we also found in one of the studies that we did into the mechanism, that was the clotting activation that we found during a flight, and it was not present during immobilization. And that was something that did surprise me, really, because, like you say, we were speculating that it was maybe the immobilization that did this trick. But at the same time, there were other centers who had been looking at hypoxia, at the influence of hypoxia, and they put people in hyperbaric chambers and measured clotting activation. And one of the first studies in which that was done in Norway by Dr. Benz. They found a clear clotting activation after being exposed to hypoxia.
Which is different than at, say, ground.
Yes, in an airplane, the oxygen level is quite low. It's comparable to being high up in the mountains. And so the oxygen levels do get quite low, and especially when people are sleeping or not breathing very well, because they're in a cramped position, I guess. Saturation can become very low. So, it did make sense to look at that.
So the sort of the combination of maybe enhanced clotting as well as the sedentary position?
Exactly. So that all those things made us to design this study in which we put volunteers in an airplane, and we flew them around for 8 hours and took blood before and after, immediately after arrival again. And we compared that to a control situation in which the same people were put in a cinema. So all the circumstances were exactly the same, apart from being in the air and being on the ground, and also the chairs and all those things, and it's sort of the same sedentary position, like you say. But then the results showed that there was hardly any clotting activation in the cinema situation, but in about 15% of the people who were in the airplane clearly did show signs of an activated clotting system after the air travel situation. So that really indicated that something else was going on in the airplane.
Well, that'll give us some pause for thought next time we climb on board going across the Atlantic or Pacific. We've been speaking with Dr. Suzanne Cannegieter. We've been discussing air travel and venous thrombosis. Is there a risk? I'm Dr. Gary Kohn, and you've been listening to the Clinicians Roundtable on ReachMD XM157, the channel for medical professionals. To comment or listen to our full library of podcasts, visit us at reachmd.com. Register with promo code RADIO and receive 6 months free streaming for your home or office. Thank you for listening.